us, and so sometimes we just run out of time. We do have closed captioning available. Go to the bottom of your screen and look for that CC button. Give it a click, that'll turn captions on. Click it again, and it'll turn them off. Then for anyone that is new, my name is Jamie. I am a licensed master social worker. When I'm not here doing these webinars with all of you, I am a therapist. Prior to that, I worked in housing. I also worked heavily in child welfare, working with kids and teens that have experienced some abuse or neglect, many of them being part of the foster care and adoption system. Now let's go over our frequently asked questions. This is being recorded, and everyone who registered for today's webinar will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording in it. Also in that email will be all of the resources we talk about today. No slides will be sent out. We do offer certificates of attendance, so everyone who registered for today's webinar and joined the live session will receive an email from certificates@mindspringhealth.org soon after the webinar ends. Complete the webinar follow-up survey that's linked in the email to receive your certificate. Certificates are not available for anyone who's only watching the recorded version of the webinar later on. And lastly, CEUs are not provided for community education webinars. All right, so what are we going to learn today? First, we're going to talk about what boundaries are, and then we're going to go over the different types of boundaries. We'll discuss why setting boundaries can be so difficult, and then we're going to end with how to set them and then how to maintain them. So ask yourself this. When you think of a boundary, what comes to mind? Sometimes people think of maybe a property line or locked fences. And these types of boundaries show where one thing ends and another begins. Now, boundaries in a relationship serve as markers, just like property lines or fences, and they're helping people understand and respect where their own personal space, thoughts, emotions, and needs begin and where another person's begins. And boundaries assist in establishing your personal comfort level and defining the way you wish to be treated by other people. Boundaries are relevant in all types of relationships, be it with a friend, a family member, a partner, or really anyone else. And there are signs that we need to be working on our boundaries. Maybe you find yourself frequently feeling resentful when people ask for too much from you. You often find yourself agreeing to do things you don't want to, simply to avoid upsetting or disappointing other people. You experience feelings of resentment because you often find yourself doing more for others than they're doing for you. You tend to maintain a certain distance from most people because you fear that by allowing them to get too close, you may become overwhelmed. You often have the feeling that most of what you do is for the benefit of others and that they may not even appreciate it as much as you would like them to. You experience more stress from the fear of disappointing others than from the actual inconvenience or drain that comes from doing the things to please them. Now, there's examples of what it would look like to have healthy boundaries. Being able to assertively say no and accept when someone else says no to you. Effectively communicating both wants and needs. Valuing and recognizing both your own needs and the needs of others while showing respect and consideration for both. Showing respect for others by acknowledging and honoring their values and beliefs, their opinions, even if they differ from yours. Feeling comfortable and empowered to share information when it's appropriate and necessary. Being adaptable and open to change without compromising in an unhealthy way. So, unhealthy boundaries are really about finding it hard to say no and struggling to accept a no from someone else. Not being clear about your needs and your wants and pleasing others by compromising personal values, beliefs, and opinions to just satisfy someone else. It also can be about using coercive or manipulative tactics to convince other people to do something that they're reluctant to do. It also can be oversharing your personal information. And unhealthy boundaries can easily transition into abusive behaviors. People who have endured childhood abuse may encounter challenges in establishing healthy boundaries as adults. The trauma they experienced can impact their understanding and ability to assert their personal and physical boundaries. Regrettably, this can perpetuate into their relationships, particularly when they're involved with an abusive partner. And these abusive behaviors can include things like violating personal safety, exerting excessive control over your life, constantly scaring you, being hyper controlling and preventing you from doing reasonable things that you'd like to do and forcing you to do things that you don't want to do. So, a simple way to identify if a boundary has been violated is to reflect on how you feel after the specific situation. So, pause and check in with yourself. Ask if you feel uneasy, uncomfortable, violated, angry in any way. Your emotions and your feelings are going to be a powerful tool in identifying boundaries, and you need to take them seriously. Trust your instincts and acknowledge your emotions as valid. If you find yourself feeling uncomfortable, it's really essential to communicate your boundaries in a clear, assertive, and respectful way. And by setting clear boundaries and ensuring that they're respected, you can promote healthier relationships and increase your confidence in your interactions with other people. Now remember, prioritizing your own well-being and respecting your boundaries is a really important part of maintaining healthy relationships. All right, so next we're going to talk about what types of boundaries there are. Before we do that, I'm going to just check some questions from this last section. So people are asking about how we set boundaries kind of with ourselves. And that's going to be a big piece of this, right? Oftentimes when we're thinking of boundaries, we're thinking about and talking about, setting a boundary with somebody else. But it is important to set boundaries with ourselves. And so kind of in the same way where we're thinking about situations where we leave feeling if like someone took advantage of us or we're not feeling very good about that interaction, we can also think about the times where we feel frustrated, disappointed with what we've done, right? Where we're maybe not happy with the choices we've made or what we've allowed to happen or the behaviors. And so looking for those things and then making a change, right? So maybe we're not happy with the amount of information we've shared. So it isn't about what someone else did, right? Or how much of someone else's energy or negative emotions we've taken in. And so that's the first step to making those adjustments, is to determine what it is that we don't like that we're allowing ourselves to do or let happen, and then making those adjustments and being aware, when do those things often happen or with who. Great question. All right, so let's talk about types of boundaries. So while we can kind of have I guess we could have a variety of categories. There are kind of 6 most common boundaries. So we have intellectual, and this involves honoring and valuing our thoughts, our beliefs, our ideas. And it also means respecting that others' ideas may be different than ours. Intellectual boundaries are crossed when someone is dismissive, belittling, and invalidates our thoughts and ideas. We have our emotional boundaries. These are our feelings, our personal details. And so we'll see emotional boundaries crossed when our feelings or personal information that we have shared with someone are minimized, or maybe they've been shared with others without our permission. Sexual boundaries are going to encompass kind of our autonomy over our sexual health, our intimate personal space, and they involve making choices regarding the types of sexual activities, timing, and partners that feel comfortable and consensual to us. These boundaries are crossed when someone pressures or coerces us into unwanted intimate affection, touch, or sexual activity without our consent. Time. And when you have a long list of responsibilities, it's challenging to keep healthy time boundaries. These boundaries are crossed when you have unreasonable demands or requests of your time, or when you take on too much. Material. This includes boundaries for our financial resources or our belongings. And these boundaries are crossed when we are feeling pressured to lend or give away or to spend or loan money when we don't want to or when we can't. And then physical. This involves our body, including its autonomy and its personal space. For example, a common physical boundary crossing that's been talked a lot about in recent years is teaching children to automatically hug relatives at family gatherings. This may cause them to have weaker physical boundaries. Right? So maybe offering a handshake or just a hello are polite alternatives instead of forcing them to hug people they don't want to hug. So let's talk about each of these. So first, intellectual. What does it look like when my ideas and perspectives have been respected? Questions we can ask ourselves to explore these boundaries include, what makes me feel that my ideas are being dismissed or diminished by others? And what can I do to take care of myself if that happens? How can I demonstrate to others that I respect their ideas and perspectives? How do I know when it's time to walk away from a discussion? Are you okay with a friendly debate? Are you okay with heated debates? Do you prefer to remove yourself from conversations before heated turns to conflict? Do you not want to debate anything at all? Maybe you don't want to debate certain things. And how will you let someone know it's time for you to remove yourself from a conversation? How will you communicate that you feel like your ideas aren't being respected? When it comes to emotional, you can ask things like, when I need to discuss something personal, who am I going to turn to? Who do I not want to share personal things with? Who will I make space to process my emotions with, and how will I make space for it? How will I check in with the person I am talking to determine their capacity for listening and for sharing? And what types of things am I not comfortable sharing? When it comes to sexual boundaries, how do I communicate consent verbally and non-verbally? How does my sexual partner do the same? What kinds of sexual intimacy am I comfortable with? What's my partner comfortable with? How do I like to communicate when being sexually intimate? What are my limits regarding sexual safety? For time, how much time do I need just for myself every day and week? What takes priority when I'm dividing up my time? If someone's asking for my time professionally, what do I charge per hour? How will I decide what extra projects to designate time for? And when it comes to your materials, what can I afford to give or share? What am I willing to give or share? How will I share what I have? Who will I share it with? And what will I not share? For physical, what types of touch am I comfortable with? Is it hugs? Is it handshakes, high fives? Nothing at all. Who am I comfortable being touched by? Friends, partners, family, coworkers? No one? And then it's also about space. Am I comfortable with people coming into my office, into my home, into my bedroom? Now, I often get asked, why is it so hard to set boundaries? If they're so important, why is it so hard to do it? So we'll talk about that next. Before we do that, let me just check some questions from this last section. Is it possible that we learned our poor boundaries from our parents? Yes. So boundaries are not something we're born with. It's a skill that we learn, and if we're not taught them, then we don't know how to do it. And for the most part, the majority of us are taught at least one boundary when we're young, and that's about good touch, bad touch. Not everyone, but a good chunk of us are taught that. Then oftentimes we're not taught anything else. I think more recent generations are being taught more about boundaries. But the older we are, the less we were taught about boundaries. And it's difficult, especially when we're thinking about being a parent and children. Right? There's a lot of times where we can't always respect kids' boundaries, right? Safety wise, they having to go to school, or making them go to the dentist and the doctor, those kinds of things. And so there are times where kids' boundaries can't be respected for their safety and health and those kinds of things. And then, at that point, when we're trying to teach boundaries and explaining, why maybe the boundary can't be respected, but that it hasn't, for the most part, been kind of a common, typical thing that has gone on. Um, and so it's not so much that our parents have sat down and gone, okay, I'm going to teach my kids poor boundaries, but it's just something that hasn't really been taught at all. And most likely it wasn't taught to them either, and it wasn't taught to your grandparents, and so on and so on. And so oftentimes it's a concept that a lot of us didn't even know existed until more recent years. And so there is a very good chance that this was something we learned from our parents because they didn't know any differently. Now, sure, yes, there are instances where our parents, repeatedly violated our boundaries, maybe in an abusive way, and we learned that, um, and that has continued into our adulthood. I think for a good portion of us in our population, it just was kind of something that we just were never taught. So someone asked, are they invading a boundary if they're checking their husband's phone if it's never been an issue and the person lets them? No, because then it's not his boundary. If the person doesn't care that you're doing something, then that's not their boundary. They don't care. Now, if they care, but they just let you do it because they're people pleasing, then yeah, that would be disrespecting a boundary continually, and they're allowing the disrespect of the boundary. Just going through some of the questions. Can we overdo the setting of boundaries? Yes. And so boundaries, it's kind of on a continuum where it goes from like weak or no boundaries all the way to rigid boundaries with healthy kind of in the middle. So we can have really weak or no boundaries at all the way to having boundaries that are too rigid. And that's not to say that we need to compromise on our boundaries necessarily, but we can have boundaries that are a bit flexible, and not every boundary needs to be flexible, but many of them can be, or they can adjust as we build trust with someone. Is there a connection between weak boundaries and self-esteem? And there can be, right? Where when we don't feel so great about ourselves, sometimes we feel like we don't deserve the respect that comes with boundaries. So yeah, that can have a connection there. Someone pointed out that sometimes the difficulty with setting boundaries isn't with the setting piece, but the follow through of them, and that can be it too, right? Some people are able to set boundaries but not follow through with the consequence, and we're going to talk in a minute about this. But boundaries are two parts, right? So it's the identifying of what your boundary is, but then following through with the consequence of not respecting the boundary. Some people aren't even able to let someone know what their boundary is. Some people are good at that, but not able to follow through with the consequence. All right, so let's talk about why it's so hard. So this can be hard for someone who's not used to doing it, especially if they're not used to expressing what their needs are, what their limits are. It can feel uncomfortable, it can feel confrontational at times, but it's really important to keep in mind that it's just essential. Right? Setting boundaries is really vital for our overall well-being and for maintaining healthy relationships. With practice, with patience, asserting our boundaries and effectively communicating them does become easier. In situations where people are used to specific relationship boundaries, it's common for them to, resist any kind of attempts to modify or establish new boundaries. And similarly, people, including children, may test or try to challenge these new boundaries within the relationship. And so these situations can be inherently stressful, as conflicts and resistance can heighten stress levels. So it's just really important to approach boundary changes and conflicts with patience, with understanding. And you might find yourself in a situation where you feel compelled to kind of bear the burden of stress rather than disappoint someone or let them down. You're trying to give all your effort and dedication to everything and everyone. And you hold the belief that refusing or saying no could be interpreted as a sign of weakness or a moral shortcoming. When you are in a healthy state, your conscientiousness serves you positively by guiding your focus and drive for excellence. But the thing to remember really is at times you can take this to the extreme and really become kind of fixated on perfection and become overly sensitive to criticism or feedback that's less than positive. And this can just lead to you impulsively saying yes to please others and seek validation and redemption or the opportunity to just prove yourself. And sometimes our sense of identity is often kind of intertwined with how much we do for other people. If you find yourself living your life as if you were Jim Carrey in that movie, The Yes Man, might be a sign that it's time for a change. Constantly saying yes to everything can take a toll on your energy and cause you to miss out on more essential opportunities to focus on your goals and really thrive. And sometimes feeling guilty or being made to feel bad about setting boundaries, it is not uncommon. In certain relationships, particularly with family members, it's common to encounter challenges when it comes to establishing and maintaining boundaries. And this issue may have originated in childhood where healthy boundaries were not adequately modeled or supported. Family members, friends, romantic partners who feel inconvenienced by our boundaries may try to manipulate or guilt trip us into disregarding them. They may use statements like, you need to be loyal to your family and always help, or, I thought you loved me, to shame us and make us doubt our boundaries. And this can be particularly challenging when we've grown up without healthy boundaries being modeled for us. There's a lack of insight or awareness into what our boundaries actually are or need to be. Sometimes it can be challenging to set boundaries because we may not be fully aware of what our boundaries are, where to start in establishing them. We may feel unsure about our needs and wants and preferences, or we might find that our boundaries have shifted without fully understanding why or what that means. So determining your boundaries does require some self-reflection and being present in your interactions with other people. By taking the time to look inside yourself and being aware of your emotional and physical reactions, you can gain insights into what makes you uncomfortable or drained, and this can help you identify what you need your boundaries to be. It's important to understand that boundaries are not only healthy, but also necessary for your well-being. So if you currently struggle with believing that setting boundaries are healthy for you, it can be challenging to fully embrace them. But I encourage you, to make a commitment to yourself to work towards developing the belief that setting boundaries is indeed positive and beneficial for your well-being, but also the health of all relationships. And recognize that boundaries are primarily an internal responsibility. Before we can establish boundaries with other people, it's really important to start by creating boundaries within ourselves. When we lack proper guidance or understanding of how to do this internal work, our boundaries can sometimes be perceived as rigid walls. So establishing healthy boundaries requires addressing personal issues and healing from any past traumas or experiences that may have impacted our boundary setting abilities. So as we engage in that inner work, we naturally begin to exhibit positive changes in our external behaviors, our habits, and our choices. All right, so next we're going to talk about how to set and then enforce those boundaries. Before we do that, let me just check a few questions. So somebody asked about setting boundaries after experiencing trauma and neglect. And that's kind of what we were just talking about, right? So we have to be able to kind of do that internal work because trauma does impact how we set boundaries. And so sometimes it results in those weak boundaries where we struggle to set the boundaries, we focus on pleasing other people more than prioritizing ourselves. Or we have really rigid boundaries where we don't let anyone in. We kind of protect ourselves at all costs. And so those things can get in the way of being able to set boundaries. And so therapy can greatly benefit us when we have those struggles with boundaries that are coming from some past traumas. So, considering some therapy can really help us, and therapy can help us in setting boundaries under all situations. Would teens who struggle with poor or weak boundaries be more likely to be impacted by peer pressure and engage in risky behaviors? And yeah, that would be a concern for sure. Someone brought up that sometimes setting a boundary equals confrontation. It does, right? Lots of times people don't like that we've set a boundary. And something to kind of think about. Oftentimes people don't want to set a boundary because it results in conflict. And that's why oftentimes we think of setting boundaries as negative. But that happens when we are setting a boundary, most often with an inappropriate person. We are setting boundaries all day long, and most of the time, it's a nonverbal. And so it's not a boundary where we're having to have a conversation with someone. So we can think of things like we ask a coworker a question and they kind of skirt around it. We have now learned that that's not something a coworker wants to talk about. They're not interested in that topic. We never ask about it again. They have just set a boundary. They didn't have to have a talk with us. You know, um, you go to the family gathering and you say to your niece, "Oh, give me a hug," and she doesn't. You've learned her boundary. You never ask again. Right? So, very often we are learning boundaries without ever having to be told. And same thing, right? Um, Someone, puts their hand on your shoulder and you just kind of slowly move away and they never do it again. They learn the boundary. The reason we think of boundaries oftentimes as something that's so negative is when we've attempted in a nonverbal way to allow someone to know that we have a boundary and they either don't pick up on it or they don't care and they don't make any change. And now we're going to have to say it. And they don't like it. And they continue to behave that way. And they're going to behave poorly when you say something about it because they don't want to have to change. They want to act however they want to act. And so, yeah, with those people, setting the boundary oftentimes does turn into confrontation. And it's unfortunate. And so then, right, it is that either guilt tripping or manipulative behavior that oftentimes makes us want to back down or just never say anything. And they know it, whether it's conscious or subconscious, and that's why they behave that way to get what they want. It doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong, though, right? And that's the thing that we need to remember. Just because we're feeling guilty does not mean we've done anything wrong. Really, all it is proof that the boundary was needed with this person. So someone asked, boundaries are really for us, right? Yeah. Boundaries are about what we need and what we are willing to participate in or do. It's not about changing someone else. Can a rigid boundary be based in trauma? Yes, many rigid boundaries are. Now, not all rigid boundaries are bad, right? I think a lot of, kind of our sexual type boundaries would be rigid ones, right? Now, there are some that are flexible, would depend on our comfortability with someone, the amount of time we've known them, the level of trust and respect, but there are some that are very, very rigid, right? And that's okay. But right, emotionally, we would want some flexibility in boundaries, and when all of our boundaries are rigid, a lot of times that is based in trauma, and it doesn't allow for us oftentimes to have some of those deeper connections. All right, so let's talk about how we are setting and then enforcing boundaries. So when we're setting them, it's really important to consider what we need and we want to achieve. And it can be challenging to identify which areas of our life require boundaries. So it's important to give yourself time and space to become aware and reflective before setting the boundaries. That self-awareness really is key in understanding our habits and values and priorities, which can facilitate boundary setting that aligns with those needs and desires. If you're struggling with where to start, consider talking maybe to a trusted friend, a family member, and of course, a therapist. That can be very helpful. But your boundaries need to be in line with your personal values. This can be an effective way of ensuring that you're being true to yourself, communicating your needs, and staying true to your beliefs. And it's important to recognize that different relationships are going to require different boundaries based on the nature of the relationship, the level of trust, and individual dynamics involved. And an example of this would be, my boundary is that I require being spoken to with respect. Well, the name that the nickname that my sister's allowed to call me is different than the nickname my friend can call me versus the name my boss can call me versus the name a stranger can call me, right? All can be considered respectful, but they all cannot be the same type of nickname, right? So in a work setting, it's important to establish maybe a more rigid boundary to maintain a professionalism, create a respectful environment, comply with legal or ethical standards. Certain behaviors like sharing personal information, engaging in sexual contact, or flirting could be considered inappropriate or even prohibited, especially between management and staff. And the nature of healthy boundaries within a family can vary based on the overall family dynamics, individual relationships within the family unit. So that's essential to consider those unique kind of characteristics, dynamics within each person. And in families where members tend to be maybe overbearing or have difficulties respecting personal boundaries, it might be important to set firmer or more rigid boundaries to protect our psychological well-being. These boundaries could define personal space, privacy, limits on intrusive behavior or excessive involvement in personal matters. Establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries is going to take practice and a lot of patience. For some people, the mere idea of setting boundaries can trigger feelings of anxiety and discomfort. And it's completely normal to experience these emotions, especially if you're not accustomed to asserting your needs. So speaking up respectfully is a crucial aspect of setting and maintaining those healthy boundaries, and taking action to implement boundaries is a vital step in creating a healthier, more balanced life. This could involve things like asking someone for clarity, respectfully correcting someone, or expressing discomfort with someone's behavior. Reiterating and reinforcing your boundaries may be necessary, especially if someone continues to disrespect or violate them. It is crucial to recognize that setting boundaries is going to be an ongoing process. It may take time for others to fully understand and then respect them. Paying attention to relationship changes is going to be important when it comes to maintaining and enforcing boundaries. When we establish healthy boundaries, it's not uncommon for some people to react negatively or struggle with the change. People who are accustomed to accommodating their needs without setting limits might feel irritated, upset, or even resentful when you realize they can no longer disregard your boundaries. So as you evolve and establish healthy boundaries, you might find that some people are supportive and respectful of your growth, while others struggle and refuse to accept your boundaries. And in some cases, it can be necessary to distance yourself from those who do not respect your boundary. Reflecting on the reasons for your boundaries is important. Helps you kind of establish, maintain, and enforce them. Understanding the importance of boundaries and how they benefit your emotional well-being is important for successfully introducing them, setting them. To establish healthy boundaries, it's important to make the time to investigate and understand kind of how you're thinking. Often when uncomfortable situations occur, it can be difficult to really pinpoint the reasons behind your discomfort. So you kind of want to look at the step in setting boundaries, to spend the time exploring and examining why this is happening for you. Why are you uncomfortable? So first, we want to start small. Introducing boundaries can be overwhelming, especially if you're not accustomed to it. It's essential to kind of approach it with patience and take it step by step. By gradually building boundaries, you can approach the process as a comfortable pace and have the opportunity for reflection and evaluation. This approach allows you to assess whether your boundaries are heading in the right direction and gives you the flexibility to make any kind of necessary tweaks or adjustments. Taking the time to build boundaries slowly ensures that they align with your needs and values. Now, it's always good to establish boundaries early on, right? Setting boundaries from the beginning is important because trying to set boundaries in a pre-existing relationship can be challenging. It's not impossible though, and lots of us are in a space where we haven't been setting boundaries, and so we need to in a pre-existing relationship. But just know, now that we're starting to learn how to set boundaries, moving forward, set them from the beginning. When you set boundaries and expectations from the beginning, it does create clarity and understanding for everyone involved. This just kind of helps prevent misunderstandings, hurt feelings, frustrations down the line. Then consistency is going to be key when it comes to maintaining the boundaries. Neglecting to maintain your boundaries can lead to confusion and potentially encourage others to form new expectations and make new demands of you. So maintaining consistency and stability is crucial in reinforcing your established boundaries and principles, making sure they're clear and unambiguous. Boundaries are really teaching people how to treat us. And when you're not consistent, especially for someone who has been treating you maybe disrespectfully, when you're not consistent with it, it's just teaching them kind of how to get away with treating you poorly. We need some effective communication when those boundaries have been crossed. So open, respectful communication is going to be a big role in this. If someone consistently is violating our boundaries, it's important to address the issue, but it doesn't have to be confrontational. We can seek to express our concerns calmly and assertively to reach a resolution. And saying no is going to be an essential part of setting the boundaries. This is especially when someone's asking something of us. And no does get easier with practice. And no is a full sentence. You don't have to say anything else, but I know that's hard for a lot of us. So you can have your answer prepared for any time you're going to say no. Now, a lot of us struggle with saying no. So your answer can be, I'm going to have to think about it and I'll get back with you. And that can turn into your answer for every single question. Every time someone asks something of you, I'm going to have to think about it and I'll get back with you. So it gives you a chance to formulate your no answer. But it can be something like, I would love to help if you actually would love to help, but I have a lot on my plate and I won't be able to give this the time, the energy, whatever it is that it deserves. It can also be something like, thank you for thinking of me. I have a lot going on and I can't give this the time it deserves. This allows you to express, it allows you to decline it, but express your appreciation that they thought of you, or express that you genuinely would like to help, but you just can't now. And so you'd like them to think of you in the future. But make sure the way you're expressing your no is genuine. If you don't ever want to help in the future, don't say that you would love to help, because that's just encouraging them to come back. So we don't want to over-explain, and we don't want to say something that is not true, right? Oh, I'd love to help, but I'm busy on Saturday. Oh, well, then we can do it on Sunday. That's how we get stuck. When we set boundaries, it's important to use I statements, right? I feel blank when blank, right? I don't like the way I'm being spoken to, or I have a hard time being part of a conversation when I'm being called names. So this is different than, I'm not going to talk to you if you're going to keep calling me names, right? Because boundaries are not about the other person. It's about what I cannot be a part of. It's about what I cannot do. Right? I can't do this. I can't be a part of this. And it's giving them an option, right? They can choose to no longer behave this way or treat you this way. And then you can stay in the conversation, or they can behave differently. Right? So if you need to be saying no to something, they've asked, I wish I could, but I've got a lot on my plate right now. Don't say you wish you could if you don't wish you could. Thanks for thinking of me, but I'm not interested. It's that simple. And so here's something that I find really helpful when we're feeling guilty about setting boundaries. So boundaries are two pieces. It's the setting of the boundary and the consequence, right? So a lot of times people ask me about setting boundaries with their mom, right? We're on the phone with mom, and mom's giving us a hard time about something. Mom wants you to give her money. You don't have money to give. You don't want to give her money, whatever it is, right? I'm sorry, Mom, I don't have the money to give. And she just keeps bringing it up. And you set a boundary. Mom, I'm not going to be able to continue to talk with you today if you keep asking for money, right? You've let her know what you can't do. And she continues. Mom, I'm sorry, I can't keep talking if we keep talking about money. She continues. All right, Mom, I'm going to have to hang up. I'll call you on Tuesday. And you hang up the phone, and we feel really guilty because you might keep calling and calling or texting and texting, and you're a terrible child. But we gave Mom a choice. And I imagine it like this. There's two packages. Imagine two packages in my hand, and they're wrapped. You can't pick and choose. They're wrapped. In this package, we stop talking about money, and you stay on the phone. In this package, we keep talking about money, and you hang up the phone. You handed Mom, here are two packages. Which one do you want? And she picked this one. She picked this one that said, hang up the phone. She picked it. She picked it. You don't have to feel guilty. Mom picked that package. All right. Here are two videos real quick that help explain a little bit of this. This is Katie Morton. She explains two things we don't want to do when we're setting boundaries.
First, ask them to change the way that they interact with you and think you're done. Boundaries are not the same as requests. A request is a forceful ask or demand that someone change their behavior. For example, I may say to someone, please don't speak to me that way, or please don't comment on my body. Those are requests. And it's a very important part of setting a boundary, but the key word there is part. Often I see people make that statement and then think that they're done, that that's all the work they had to do when setting boundaries. But a boundary is about managing your behavior. And so it includes one more thing. It includes a plan for what you're going to do to keep yourself safe and healthy if someone crosses that boundary. Think about it this way. You happen upon a field and there's a gate. That feels like a boundary to some of us. We would never dream of crossing that without being invited in, right? That's private property. I'm not going to trespass. But let's be honest, boundaries are not for people like that. Boundaries are for people who might think to themselves, I could probably cut through this field on my ways to get somewhere. They barely even notice the gate. So a boundary is more than that fence or gate. It's also got a sign on it that says, trespassers will be prosecuted. This is now not only a barrier, but a plan for how to enforce that barrier. That's what you need in your boundaries. So you may ask someone to change their behavior and then think to yourself, well, what's my plan if they don't?
So it might be something like, I can't participate in a conversation where I am, being called names or whatever that is. And you don't automatically have to say, or I'll hang up on you. You might just think it, but it may come to the point where we have to verbalize the consequence and then implement it. And here's another thing we don't want to do.
Focus on trying to change someone else's behavior. This is a biggie. Boundaries are not about trying to change how someone else is behaving. Of course, in the dream world, when I ask someone to stop doing something, the end result is that they stop doing it. And it's very easy to think about boundaries this way. I'm setting this boundary to get them to stop. But unfortunately, that's not always how it works. And when we focus on changing someone else's behavior as the goal of a boundary, we're stepping out of what we can control. And we might end up feeling helpless and powerless because we can't control what other people do. And boundaries are not about feeling hopeless or helpless. They're about empowerment. They are about taking back what you can control, which are your choices and your behavior.
Sometimes people won't like our boundary, and that's okay. And it's just remembering that if someone doesn't like it, if they throw a fit, it's just more evidence that the boundary needed to be set. So remember, right? Walls are keeping everybody out. Boundaries are teaching people where the door is to have access to us. Here's some more resources, support groups, the full video from Katie on what not to do when we're setting boundaries. You'll get links to all of this in that email we send out tomorrow. Here are crisis resources. You'll get all of this in that email we send out tomorrow as well. Upcoming webinars, just remember today's Wednesday, double feature day. We'll be back here in an hour to talk about relationships, family, and mental health. The link to register for that is in the chat. So if you haven't registered, go do that now. Just a reminder, daylight savings time ends Sunday, November 3rd, which is soon, which was wild to me. So the time for where MindSpring is located changes. Pay attention if that changes what time you see us at. I know everybody can be at different schedules with daylight savings time. We'll make sure you get the link to register for all of our webinars in that email we send out tomorrow. If you need more resources, head on over to our website, mindspringhealth.org, or find us on social media, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at Mindspring Info, or on LinkedIn at Mindspring Mental Health Alliance. You can send us an email at info@mindspringhealth.org. And here are our frequently asked questions in case you missed it in the beginning. This has been recorded, and everyone who registered for today's webinar will receive an email with a link to the recording in it. Also in that email will be all of the resources we talked about today. No slides will be sent out, and CEUs are not provided for community education webinars. What we do provide are certificates of attendance once you've completed our post-webinar survey. Our goal is that everyone leaves here feeling like they learned something, and this survey lets me know if we reach that goal. Organizations that support our webinars want to know how their donations are used and what communities participate. The data is randomized, it's confidential, and no one's demographic information is shared. So everyone who registered for today's webinar and joined us during the live session will receive an email from certificates@mindspringhealth.org soon after the webinar ends. Complete the survey within 48 hours to receive your certificate. Even if you don't want a certificate of attendance, we'd love for you to complete the survey. Your participation helps us to continue to offer free webinars. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you back here